So hello everybody, and welcome to our third installment of the Quick Take sessions. This is the third installment for Content Matrix. Today we are going to look at some common issues and configuration options for migrating workflows with the Content Matrix SharePoint Edition. So we'll go over mainly focusing on Nintex workflows. SharePoint Designer workflows will sort of come into the picture as we look at configurations and what to look for basically, and the reasons why certain migrations are required for migrating the workflows, where others we can't migrate certain aspects of workflows. And we'll take a look at a couple of common issues that we normally see. One is with workflow history on previous versions of workflows. I may not be able to get to the renamed workflows. That's for SharePoint Designer, but we'll also look at this double hop issue that we can often see when trying to migrate the workflow instances. So with that, I will actually jump into my demo environment so we can really take a look at the, at firsthand at our configuration options. We'll look at, the first thing we'll look at is a Nintex migration and what to do to get this, to get it set up so that we can get both the Nintex workflow associations over and also the Nintex workflow instances, which are your workflows in progress. So one of the main things that I see that can be overlooked is setting up the console to be able to handle the Nintex migrations. And the reason is that Nintex, of course, has their own databases which are attached to both, to all, your SharePoint environments, 2007, 2010, or 2013. So the first thing we have to do is go into our ribbon and go to the Manage Nintex Workflow Databases. So here, what we want to do is we want to add all of our Nintex databases from all the different environments that we are going to be copying from and to. So I have my 2007 Nintex database, and I've attached that because in this demo I'm going to be migrating some workflows from 2007 to my 2013 environment. So I've attached my Nintex workflow database for 2013 and the one for 2007. To actually attach them, we just simply hit the new, and then we choose our SQL Server where the Nintex database is and connect. We browse for the database, and so in this case there's my Nintex database, so I would just hit OK and then connect to it. I've already connected to it, so I don't need to do that. The next step is to connect our source and target environments to the Nintex database that we'll be using within the migration. So in this case, this environment is obviously using the 2007 Nintex database. So I want to attach my external connections, and I'm going to attach a Nintex workflow database. Now the catch here is that the first thing we need to do is select Attach Databases from a database view. That allows us to now control what we want to add and remove. So when you're first setting it up, it'll look like this. Well, it'll look like that read-only. So you set it to attached, and then you can move over. So just click the database that belongs for that environment, and then you just add it. So now I've added my 2007 Nintex database to my source, and I want to do the same thing to my target connection. So I do the same attach, and you see that this has been attached using, so I've used my 2013 database and attached that. So this allows us to know which database to write to during the migration and which one to read from. There are SharePoint environments that have multiple databases based on different web applications might use different Nintex databases, so you can manage them and attach all of them here and then attach them to individual site collections or web applications for your individual migration purposes. Now, there are certain connection adapter limitations as well. Now, this connection here is using the Metalogix Extensions web service. So that allows us the full ability to migrate all workflows of all types and the workflow association content preservation as well, which is your running workflow instances. Now, if we are connecting using the native web service connection on our source, if there's no other means to connect, then you can see that all our workflow options are disabled. So unfortunately, using the native web service connection, we cannot migrate any workflows at all. Now, for Office 365 connections, recently added is the ability to preserve additional workflows. So we can now preserve workflow associations for SharePoint Designer workflows going to an Office 365 environment. And just so a note, I didn't mention at the start, but we'll do the 15-minute, and then we'll do the next 15 is Q&A. So any questions that you post, I'll get to them after the 15 minutes of the little demo that I do here. Okay, so that sort of goes over the connection requirements. So connection requirements would be a database connection, a read-only database, or a local connection or a remote connection using the web service. For the source and to the target would require the Metalogix web service, the local connection, or Office 365 connection to preserve the SharePoint Designer workflow associations. Now, we also require for Nintex and SharePoint Designer to do a full site copy. So if I have my demo site here, in order to preserve the workflows that I have attached to the expense documents library here, I need to actually copy the entire site, as you see below, the pay site as subsite. The reason for that is that workflows, all the configuration files for the workflows are stored in this hidden library that we can see in the tree view, but you can't see on the site itself in the browser. So we need to obviously migrate these definition files at the same time that we migrate the workflow associations in order to reattach them to the same libraries that are on the target. So you can see here I have an Nintex workflow which is called expense approval, and within that folder are the actual configuration files that SharePoint holds for that workflow. Of course, other information is stored in the Nintex database itself. So with that, I'm going to jump into a couple of issues that we normally see and certain ways to work around these issues. So the first issue that we often see are, we have a list, as you can see here, and the expense approval workflow has, each item has workflows either in progress or completed. So these are your workflow instances, or the running workflow data. But if we look at the library settings, if we look at our workflow settings, we see that the workflow itself has been changed a couple of times so that we have previous versions of the workflow. So right out of the box, you could see that normally only workflow instances are allowed on the current version of the workflow. So that means that when we copy the site over to the target environment, you'll see that we can only actually copy the workflow instance data that belongs to the current version of the workflow itself. So what we found that if you need to bring over the history and the workflow instance data of workflows from previous versions, then what you need to do is go in and change the workflow settings, choose remove a workflow, this is from your source, and then you set the previous versions to allow. You do that prior to the migration, and then when you do the migration, you would find that yes, they are, now we preserved them all, but you can see there's a bit of an issue here because now we have a workflow status column that represents each of the individual versions. Now, if you were to go into the target library at this point, go into your settings, choose your workflow settings. Now, if I go into the same thing here, and if I allow these previous instances on the target, when I go back, you'll see that SharePoint will change the status columns. So now it will actually show you the workflows in progress and from which version that it was started in. And if you need to at that point, you could go into the view. You could modify the view, and you didn't have the option to maybe just drop out the showing the workflows in progress from the previous versions, or maybe you remediate, cancel the workflows from those versions, or restart them on the new version, and then you can switch it to then only show the current version of the workflow. So another issue that we do find is making connections to the remote Metalogix web service connection to a source environment or using the target environment. We may see an issue of a double hop, which means that the user details, so your login information is passed through the web service and to the SharePoint object model, and then when we go to fetch the workflow instances, it's a second hop over to the SQL Server. And when that happens, often without using a Kerberos authentication, those login details may get missed or they don't get passed along, so the workflow instance data does not get copied. Now in that case, we have a solution to override that, and that is called the DB override utility, which you can find in the program files folder for the Content Matrix Console SharePoint Edition. And if you go into the support utilities folder, you can find the DB override executable. So you may need to, so to do that, to set it up, you need to copy the utility over to your environment that is experiencing the issue and move it over into all of the web front ends of the environment, and then you just run the utility, and all it does is take a username password, which is a SQL Server authentication account. So what we need to do is actually pass an account that's created in SQL Server, so meaning that you would have to have both Windows and SQL Server authentication enabled on your SQL Server. So what we do, I have a Metalogix account created in the SQL Server. So I would just assign the account, the password, and what this does, it encrypts it and saves it, and it must save it to the C program data metalogics folder in this XML file, so that once we run that on all the web front ends, the web service will take those credentials and pass it to the SQL Server in order to be able to retrieve the information we need. Okay, so yeah, it goes by fast, but that is the 15-minute quick demo of the workflow issues. I know it's hard to cover everything in 15 minutes, so what we'll do is we already have a few questions posted up here, so we'll go through the Q&A now for the next 15 minutes and hopefully be able to cover everyone's questions. So the first question I get here is it necessary to map the Nintex databases if you are not migrating to a different version or environment? In version 6 of Content Matrix, that was not necessary, and the Nintex database that was mapped in SharePoint took care of that. Well, if you are copying workflows within the same farm, it's probably not necessary because we would pick up that, but I would still add that. I would still set up the database and still attach it to my source and targets just to be on the safe side. So the next question is, can we migrate only SharePoint Designer workflows for a library instead of a site migration? So for SharePoint Designer workflows, we must do a full site copy. We wouldn't be able to copy an individual list and paste that list and preserve any workflows at all. So we have to do a full copy for that, or a full site copy for that in order to preserve the workflows. Okay, so next question I have here. So if we're developing a workflow and want to promote that workflow from a non-production environment to a production environment, you need to copy the entire site over. If you have a library in the production environment that is being actively used and the instance of that library in the non-production does not contain all of the data that the production does, will the site copy replace the library or merge the contents of the library such as there is not data loss? Well, fortunately, our full site copy also requires, so it requires a full copy, meaning a full overwrite of the workflow. So if we, I think the question implies can we do an incremental copy over to update workflows? And the answer is unfortunately not yet, because the only support right now is for a full copy, and so any of the content that requires the workflow, any libraries that have the workflows would be overwritten on the target. Okay, so the next question is, instead of using the DB override utility, do you have a service mapping that will allow us to create the SPNs required to enable Kerberos authentication and pass the credentials? Well, basically, if you have Kerberos authentication enabled and running on the farm that you're connecting to, then the DB override utility is not required. So Kerberos will allow the pass-through to occur, the credential pass-through, whereas the normal Windows authentication does not. So the next question I have, do SharePoint built-in and SharePoint Designer Workflow Associations come over without having to perform a DB write? So all workflow associations will come over without doing a DB write. So it's good to differentiate between the workflow associations and workflow instance data. So this is the content instance data where these are your running workflows. These are the ones that require the database writing. So any workflow associations, they do not require any DB writing. And that's for all Nintex, SharePoint Designer, and out-of-the-box workflows do not require any DB writing. And so when I refer to the workflow association, I really just mean this part of the workflow. So the workflow that's published to a list itself. Okay. So the next question is complete. How about the complete custom workflow using Visual Studio and having multiple instances running on it? Another one is how the target GUID association persists. Well, so normally Visual Studio workflows should be supported. They behave much like SharePoint Designer workflows. So all the workflow files are stored in the workflows table, and they're stored within their own folder. And when we do the migration, we do mappings, and we will do a GUID mapping. One of the reasons why we need to do a full site copy. We apply a GUID mapping so that the same workflow gets associated to the same list on the target site, and it updates the link. So it does the link correction, and it does update the GUIDs. So the next question is, does the content matrix automatically upgrade an Nintex 2007 workflow to make it compatible with 2013? That's actually a good question. We're actually working on making that fully supportable. Right now, I'm demoing going from 2007 to 2013, but there are instances where on the 2013 side, and it occurs with more complex workflows that they cannot be published on the 2013 side. Certain operations within the workflow may not be functioning in the 2013 site at this point. So that's kind of a known issue with Nintex, that it can't upgrade from 2007 to 2013. So we're actually looking at ways that we can do it within the XAML files in order to fully update them to 2013 workflows. Right now, simple workflows should be working fine. And we can see that going to my library and my workflow settings, that is very, this one is a very simple workflow. And I should be able to still publish it. So the next question is, does the Microsoft support the DBs after a DB write has been performed during a workflow migration? Well, the answer to that is that the Microsoft doesn't support any direct DB writes to a SharePoint content database. So the answer to the question is, if you really, really need to preserve instance data, then you have to do so knowing that that's an unsupported operation in terms of Microsoft support. Now, we don't do any DB writes unless you actually go in and change low-level settings in order to activate those features. And you'll see that when you do activate them, we do give you a good notification that what you're doing, that does require the direct writing to the database. Any operation that you might have activated will indicate when you set it that it is going to do that, so that you're not going to do it without your knowledge. The next question. So if you allow the migration to write to the database to preserve the workflow data, Does it write to the DB for the entire migration or just the workflow related items? And it is the latter. So it only does the workflow, it only does the writing in the instance where it has to, otherwise it will use the API. So it will only write workflow instance data to the database and nothing else. So the next question, can a copy be done with a tree of sites all having workflows? And yes, yes, indeed, I could do my entire site collection migration, and all subsites, it would copy all of the workflows of all the sites and all the subsites. I hope I understood that question correctly. Okay, so another question is using filter options to copy over list workflows, and how is that possible? So you may be able to do a full site copy and only bring over the lists that contain the workflows and filter out all other lists. But when you do that filtering, so for example, if you're going to filter lists and libraries, you must include all of the related lists for the workflow. And that includes the workflow tasks, the workflow history, and the workflows table. So if you were to set display name, equals, my expense documents, and then name equals Nintex workflows, and name equals workflow history, and name equals workflow, so include everything involved with the workflow, then you should be able to copy just those items and leave behind any other lists that you don't want to copy that don't have workflows. So what happens to the workflow history if a DB write is not performed? So what happens really is that the workflow history would get copied, but you may not have a proper linking to the actual workflow. So workflow tasks, when you do not copy, that's actually a good question, because when you do not copy workflow instance data or then we will only copy the associations. We will skip the workflow tasks that are associated with workflows. The workflow history would get copied, but it would not be really linked to any of the, obviously it wouldn't be linked to the item any longer. And so it wouldn't have a full, look at the tasks and look at the workflow history. So another question, does the DB override function take the place of having to supply credentials in the DB mapping of the Nintex database step? So if you don't map the Nintex databases, you don't wish to map hundreds of individual mappings for multiple users. The DB override tool is a single mapping, and it doesn't apply to actually a user mapping situation. So the DB override is set just once for a SQL authentication account to allow us to retrieve workflow instance data from the content database, not the Nintex database, actually. So the next one, the question related to user mapping. So that one I'll have to skip because it's not really related to the workflows. So is it required to have a DB connection for migrating SharePoint Designer workflows? It is not required to have a DB connection, but it will. A DB connection will support the SharePoint Designer workflows and will also eliminate the need for the DB override, as it is a direct connection to the database itself. So another question, and I think I should be able to get through the next three. So tried to move a large 2010 SharePoint Designer workflow from a dev to staging. The workflow came over to the staging farm, but most of the list fields associated with the workflow are missing. edit the workflow manually, fix it every time it's consuming. That's not really expected behavior, so for that one, I would recommend that you raise a ticket to work with one of the support reps and identify what's going wrong there. So the next question, if I were to remove a site to a new location within the same site collection without going to the new farm, will the workflow history still get skipped without a DB write? And yes, the answer to that is yes. To maintain that workflow, the running workflow data always requires the DB write. And I guess the last question, is it necessary to actually edit the XML for the DB writing, or is that taken care of now by just clicking on the parameter to migrate instances? So we still have to edit our, so if I go into my C program data, Metalogix folder, we have our environment settings.xml file, and this setting, allow DB writing, must be set to true in order to allow us to activate those features. Without that setting on, then you will not be able to activate the DB writing features. Okay, so I guess we're out of time already. Lots of questions, so it might be a good idea to have another session to take us deeper into workflow migration. Otherwise, we'll have another topic in a couple weeks. So thank you everyone for joining, and hope you can take something away from this. Hope it has helped, and I guess we will see you in a couple weeks for the next Content Matrix Quick Takes. So thank you everybody.